Hey everyone, and welcome to an intro to World Creator 2. I'm Tyler, and in this video, we're going to discuss our fourth biome, the tropical biome. But instead of jumping straight into the filter stack, we're going to do a bit of custom terrain sculpting first. This is a bit of a different process than the custom base shape editing we've been doing before, and to showcase this method, let's begin by experimenting with sculpting options in a new World Creator 2 file. So I have a new World Creator 2 project file open here, and let's go ahead and just flatten out this a bit. So go to Custom Base Shape, Edit Shape, Flatten Entire Terrain, yes we want to, and then we're just going to click Done Editing Shape. At this point, let's go up to the Areas tab, add a new area. Don't care about what it's named, but let's go ahead and click on the Fit to Terrain Size and adjust the border blend to about 0.9 like we've been doing before. Now, in order to sculpt or manually paint the shape of the terrain, we need to ensure the Has Height Map field here is enabled. Once enabled, you will see a new panel section appear here at the bottom. For the most part, this is very similar to the blend map properties, but with a few more height map related options. For example, if you already have a height map that you want to use, you can go ahead here and click Load Height Map. You can also save whatever height map you've created in World Creator out to be used in some other application or be reused right here within World Creator 2. You could clear any results that you've already created, or if you like to blur your results just a little bit, you can constantly click the blur button and it'll gradually keep blurring your height map results. The operation here is a very important setting in that it sets the stage for how the height map will be blended with the underlying terrain. Default means it will take priority over the base terrain, and in most cases, I almost always use this operation or addition. If we were to click on this button here, we can see some other operation types, and for me, most of the time, I actually use the addition operation. The next setting that is nice is the Blend Map as Mask property here. It's essentially saying that wherever you've painted in a blend map, that only whatever you do in the height map edit will appear within the blend map paint. The border blend range here is exactly how you're used to the border blend range in the blend map properties. And again, in this case, we're just going to go ahead and set the lowest range here to about 0.9. That way, if we're painting a little bit close to this edge, we don't get any harsh cuts. We'll come back at a later date to cover the height offset and the height scale. Then weight strength here is important as it sets the height map's overall strength level, sort of like an opacity slider for the mask itself. The next setting is also a very important setting to understand. That is the level step setting right down here in this bottom slider. Here we get to choose which level step we want the height map to be painted on in regards to how the terrain generator is being affected. 6 is the default because it provides a good middle ground for all the filters to work. What this means is that if we have level step 6 as our setting, then all the levels below 6 will not be used for filter generation, and only level step 6 and above will be used. So knowing that, we may want to adjust our level strength sliders for any individual filters that may be distributing in the area of the height map that we're going to be painting. Now, if you uncheck the Use Level Step checkbox here, you get the options to specify how much of each level you want to affect. When we had level step 6 specified earlier, that essentially means this level strength step slider here was set to 100%. You can certainly get really creative with the results here by adjusting the different level step sliders. But for our purpose here, we're just going to make sure we have the Use Level Step checkbox activated and make sure that we have the level step number 6 chosen. If you want a full breakdown of this section, I've already linked a video in the description that covers this in a much greater detail. Next, I want to uncheck the Show Blend Map checkbox here. That way we can see exactly what we're doing on our terrain when we edit our height map. So at this point, we can go down here to the bottom right of our Properties panel and click Edit Height Map. For the most part, the settings and options for painting a height map is the same settings for painting a blend map. We have our different brush options that we can select from and all of the same or similar brush settings. What's different are the brush effect tools, which you'll see in this line of icons right here. With our brush, we can affect the terrain by raising it or lowering it. We can flatten it to a specified height. We can smooth it out a little bit, which is almost like averaging out the effects of wherever the brush size is, but it adds a little bit more of a smooth gradient tone. While the average flatten does a similar thing to flatten and smooth, but in a much more rougher stage. So if we were to select this brush here, and let's change our brush size to be about 300, and change our brush strength to around 75, 76%. If we were to go here on our terrain and start clicking and painting, you can see we are dynamically affecting the height map of the shape of the terrain. We can select lower in the brush settings and do the same type of click method, and you can see that we are now lowering the terrain. If we were to flatten, we can then specify a certain height. So let's see what our observer tool is. So it says it's about 50 meters somewhere in the middle of this cliff edge. So here at our height setting, let's specify that to be 50. And let's up our strength to 100%. And then if we zoom in here somewhere in the middle, let's click and hold and paint around a little bit. And if you notice with our mouse hovered right in this area where we're painting, the elevation data in our observer tools in the top left says it is 50 meters, as opposed to near 0 meters here, or in this area, it's around 80 meters. So this is a good way to do any sort of custom terrace effects to get the exact height that you want. If we were to select the smooth brush and up this to somewhere around, say, 500, brush settings, I like to go to around 0.2, 0.1 in this area. So for this, let's click and hold, and you can see that we are now smoothing out the effect between everything that is within this circle. And lastly, if we chose the flatten average, and let's specify this to be a little bit higher of a brush and a higher for percentage, we can then go to somewhere that's really obtuse, like over here, and click and hold. And you can see now it is going to basically try its best to average whatever the height was here at the top with the average of whatever the low here is in the bottom. Let's see that again on this clean edge over here. If we do a little bit of click action. So each time you click, I want to make that very clear. Each time you click for the flatten, it's going to do the average for that moment that you've clicked. So one good thing that you could do is keep clicking a few times, and then get the average to recalculate itself over and over. Let's go ahead and clear our height map. And one setting I would like to point out is this continuous paint option right here. Let's go ahead and check this. And again, click raise, and we're going to keep the same settings that we have here. So this paintbrush allows us to essentially make the brush stroke endlessly apply detail to the terrain as long as you are holding in the middle mouse button, and upon release, it stops the action. So right here on our terrain, if I were to click, hold, and drag across, you can see that it is continuously adding more detail as long as I'm holding down the mouse button. And once I release the mouse button, it stopped itself at roughly this area. Let's go ahead and clear this. And when you're using the continuous paintbrush option, I would highly recommend to lower the brush strength to somewhere around 0.1 or 0.15. That way you can easily work with the terrain and not have it jump so drastically. So let's do this again with the brush strength set at 0.1. If I were to click, hold, and drag, you can see that it is much easier to manage and it doesn't jump around as fast. But do keep in mind that if I were to stop, at this point, I am still holding down on the left mouse button. It's not adding any detail until I physically move the mouse. So if I were to keep hovering around and moving the mouse in this single location, it's going to constantly add detail. And of course, if you want even more control with the continuous paint, you can set the brush strength even lower. Maybe it's somewhere around 0.01. And as you paint, you can have a little bit more control on your paintbrush strokes. And one other little bit of information I want to share with you is whenever you have one of these brush options selected, if you were to press shift and click, it'll do the reverse action. Particularly, you want to do this without the raise or lower action. So if we have the raise action here, let's go ahead and uncheck continuous painting and set our brush strength back up to around 0.5. So here I'm just going to regular mouse left click, and it's going to add the stroke. If I were to shift click, it's going to do the opposite and reduce that or erase what we've done in the opposite direction. Pretty handy instead of you having to go back and forth and setting all these settings manually. And once you have a general height map of what you want, we can then click Done Edit Height Map. And we can even go up here and add filters to generally see what our height map is going to do. So if I were to add a few different filters here, then we can easily see what the height map that we generally painted and created and added new filters to basically make this an entirely new terrain shape. Once you have something created like this, you can even go back to your areas panel and then go back to edit the height map. And at this point, if I were to click somewhere over here, you can see that it is adding in more detail as I'm clicking. And you'll notice that it's taking a little bit longer to add that in as I'm clicking. If I were to click, hold, and drag, it's going to take a little bit longer to add this effect in. That's because it's trying to add all that detail in as close to a real-time manner as possible. So it's utilizing all of your GPU power to not only add the height map, but generate all of those filters that you've added on top of this height map. So logically, the more filters you use, the much more tedious that real-time process could be. But there is one nifty little setting that you can do to alleviate this further on. If we were to go up here to the General tab here, we can select either skip filters on move or skip filters on paint. Skipping filters on the move will hold any filter generation while you're moving the area mask as a whole, while the skip filters on paint essentially allows you to skip any of the filter generation while you're painting the blend map or the height map. Let's go ahead and select the skip filters on paint and go back to our areas and then edit the height map. So now if I were to go somewhere, let's say in this area, when I click somewhere on the terrain, you're going to see something happen with the terrain really quickly. Now I'm still holding in on the left mouse button, and as I'm holding this in, you can see that it has basically removed any of the filter generation process that we had and is now showing me what the terrain looked like at the base setting while I was painting the height map. Now once I release on the left mouse button, you can see that it jumps back to our previous scene and adds those filter effects on top of the height map edit change that we just did. Coincidentally, if you want to hide any of these effects while you're doing anything without having to worry about these skip filters on paint, you can easily go over here to the item that looks like a little mountain that says toggle filters. You hit that or press F4 and it'll essentially remove all the filters. And then once you are done and satisfied with your height map, you can press F4 or click the icon here in the left toolbar and it'll regenerate all of those filters. So this is just a quick way to paint in more detail on your height map without having any of those boggle down issues. Now, if we already had a terrain sort of designed the way we want, and then we want to go ahead and sculpt a little bit after the fact, similar to how we're going to do in our main project, then we need to make sure that the operation is set to addition just like it is here. If we were to select the default operation, you can see that the base height map property settings are going to override the underlying base terrain. So let's ensure that the operation is, for the most part, set to addition. And that's going to allow us to paint on the terrain without interrupting any of the underlying detail and allow us to customize the shape a bit further any way we want. Now that we understand the basics of sculpting, let's jump on over to the main project and create the tropical biome. So here we are right back in our main project, and if I go up to the Areas tab, you can see that I've already created a tropical area and I've already gone through the process of masking in exactly where we want this area to be. I've essentially, in this case, followed the area around the ridge line here for our mountain. And when it came down to combining the dune area with our tropical area, I've just made sure that it was a little bit more of a smooth transition using the same methods that we used in previous episodes. Now let's go ahead and click Has Height Map. And you can see that because our operation is set to default, it has basically removed all of the underlying terrain. So let's go ahead and make sure that operation is set to addition, and then set the border blend range for our height map properties to somewhere around 0.8, 0.9. So I'm just going to put 0.8 in this field. And so that we can see what we're doing a little bit easier, I'm just going to disable the Show Blend Map checkbox here. And then for our case, I don't want the level step slider to be the default 6. I want to affect more of the broader detail and let a lot of our filters that would normally like to use level step 6 indeed use that level. So in this case, let's try lowering the level step to something around 5. And that way we can have more level steps affect our filters. We might, after we edit the height map, adjust this level step between 4, 3, and even 6 just to get an idea of what those levels might do to the underlying terrain. And just like all the previous biomes, let's go up here to the texture tab and just make sure that the base sketch that we've been using to design all of our biomes is indeed showing. That way we can make sure that all of the ridge lines that we want to create in our sculpt is matching our design sketch. As you can see on screen, we're basically in this case wanting to implement some of these sharper ridges, but maybe not as sharp as the ones that you see here in this picture, which is in Hawaii. I want it to be a little bit more subtle than that, but still have the underlying effect. So at this point, let's go back up to the Areas tab, click Tropical, and then go down here and select Edit Height Map. So for this case, I'm going to make sure that continuous painting is unchecked. I'm going to select one of these two right here in the middle. Let's just start with this one right here, a little bit subtle effect. I'm going to ensure that my brush size is somewhere around 250 range. And the brush strength is very important in this case. I don't want to just go really hard. I want to make sure that it's really low and manageable. So something about 0.1 should be pretty good. So the whole case of what I want to do is pretty much follow or create these built up ridge lines and ensure that these two main rivers that I want to create are indeed evident in the design, as well as our beach edge right here. So let's go up here and let's just very gracefully go and stroke down, and we're just going to keep doing a couple different strokes, maybe insinuate this one a little bit more, have a couple smaller ones here, but the main one is going to be right through here. So let's go ahead and add a couple of these. Now I'm going to start not all the way at the very top because the ridges aren't going to be touching at the very peak, and not to mention that's where our blend map edge is. Now we could paint there, but it's probably going to be to our effect of starting somewhere just lower than that. You can see that I have the hide filters on paint strokes, so I'm going to let go. And now you can see this tiny little ridge line that has popped up a little bit more. Here I want to bump this ridge up and make sure that we have the water that comes off this hill curve itself into the river right here. So we're just going to bump this area up just so that we can get the filters to do exactly what we want. I'm going to hold shift and then click to remove some of it right here. That seems to have done pretty well. I'm going to bump this up just a tad right in this area. And let's increase this ridge here just a tad bit. You see the changes that we're making are extremely subtle, but it's that subtleness that has the best effect. I'm gonna bring one through here, just ever so slightly come to the very top, drag down, and then let go about when you get to the bottom. There we go. If you want to see your landscape a little bit easier while you're sketching this and go back and forth between your actual sketch, just click the toggle texture icon here, and then we can hide and see what our paint strokes are doing in our case, and then we can bring it back. I want to try to make this particular ridge come all the way down to this edge, not too sharp, but sharp enough to have it built up a little bit. This is going to be rounded off a little bit with our filters that we're going to add, so don't worry if it's too sharp right now. You can see this particular ridge line is having a nice curve to this point, and that's exactly what I want to do in this case. Let's make this area a little bit more prominent. Maybe here we're going to lower this area a tad. Kind of have it a swoop action right here, almost a S curve. and then come out like you saw me there to the bay. And don't worry how straight these are. These are relatively straight right now. We're going to definitely affect that in just a little bit with our filters. But you can certainly do any of that shaping here that you want. And I'm actually going to do that right here. I don't like how this peak is coming in right here. I want it to be more at this angle. So let's erase some of this and add it back right here. You can see that filter is starting to pop back in exactly where we want it. There we go, that's looking a little bit better. Let's increase this brush size to about 300 and widen our scope here. Drop this one down to 200 so that we can do some smaller ridges here, because I want there to be multiple little water pathways on this edge of this ridge. There we go, that's looking pretty good. We got multiple smaller ridge lines here and a few much larger ones. So now let's take a look and see what this looks like without our sketch texture. All right, this half is looking pretty good. These are looking like they attach a little bit too close to the top. So let's go ahead and reduce some of their connection at the very peak. We still want there to be a peak showing, but the filters are really going to insinuate that a little bit more. So I'm going to reduce how sharp this is at the very top just a little bit. All right, this is looking pretty nice. Let's go ahead and see what our sketch is going to look like by comparison. And you can see in this case, I, for the most part, kept up with trying to keep these valleys here for our rivers in shape for whenever we add our filters. I've kept up with this ridge line here because it's nice to have a single good prominent ridge transition into some smooth hills right out to the bay area or the sea level. These are a little bit of a different case. They're much further back into the tropical zone, so they're going to be much harsher, kind of hidden by those sea gusts. So that's one reason why in this case you see they're pretty much straight down to the edge. I could boost this up to have a sharper point at the base, but that's not necessary because our filters are going to blur a lot of this transition off on the lower portions of the terrain. And we're going to be keeping a lot of the ridge peaks here at the higher portion of the terrain. So at this point, let's go ahead and worry about getting the bottom area or the sea level of our terrain sort of shaped up the way we want. So the first thing I want to do to make sure that we start editing this is everything that's here at the beach edge and out into the sea is as flat as possible. So let's choose the flatten tool here. Let's open up our observer tools and see about where this point is. So it says it's about -16. So let's over here in the height map properties, so let's set this value to -20 because I want most of this to be really below the ground here. I'm going to select the larger circle here and make sure its brush strength in this case is set to 100 and a brush size of about 300. And sketch in this area, and you can see it's sort of flattening itself out. Now, even though we chose the flatten tool and we set the height to -20, you'll see that this terrain isn't all the way flat like you would expect it to be at -20, like I showed you in the test world creator landscape. That's because since we set the operation to addition, we're still getting some of that underlying terrain detail that is below level step 5 that is still having an effect on our terrain here. That's okay. I just basically want the sea to be mainly below sea level, but right here at this transition, it's still going to have a gradual up transition. We're going to cover how to do the beach design later on, but this is going to give us a good census for how we want to design this area. So now let's go ahead and try and smooth some of this edge just a little bit more. And let's do that by selecting the smooth tool. I'm going to ensure the brush size is set to 300 and a brush strength of around 0.15 should be pretty good. So I'm just going to paint through this area and smooth this transition a little bit more so it's not such a harsh terraced effect. There we go, that should do it. So for now, we should be fine to add the filter stack to see how this height map affects the terrain details, and then we can come back again later and affect the height map even more if we need to. Okay, so now I'm going to select Done, Edit Height Map, because we have a pretty good starting base here. And let's go up to the Surface tab, Filters, and we've already got a tropical layer started, but within this layer, let's select the area that we want it to be, which will be the tropical layer. So now anything that we do will be adhered only to the tropical area that we've painted. Before we start adding the areas, let's again just make sure that our textures are hidden here. The first filter I'm going to add is the Smooth filter, which is under the General category and down here under Smooth. And then for the smooth strength, I'm simply going to click one more notch ahead so that we can have a smooth strength level of 2. That way some of the harsher effects are just a little bit more subtle. We can add and close, and then we can simply at this point go ahead and select the toggle heat maps to see exactly where this smooth filter is being distributed. And you can see it is perfectly aligning to where we have our area mask. Let's go ahead and add our next filter, and this time let's go up to the Advanced Erosion category, and then go down and select Hydro Simulation. For the Hydro Simulation, I want to ensure that viscosity is turned down to somewhere around 0.5, and the irregularity slider is turned to somewhere around 0.9. So to explain those a bit further, viscosity is a value of liquids representing how much deformation the liquid will be. So for example, a higher viscosity will be thicker liquid like mud or lava, while a lower viscosity would be more like water, thus having a much less subtle effect. So the higher the viscosity, the more the liquid will essentially carve away from the terrain. So let's set this level back to around 50%. The irregularity option will describe how well the liquid will flow together. Essentially, this setting will change how many cuts or streams the liquid will create on a slope. So for example, if I turn the irregularity down to somewhere really low, it's going to produce many more irregularities or striations along these slope edges. But in our case, we don't want that. This is a bit too much, so we want to set this to be pretty high, back to around 0.9 to where we have it. That way we still get these irregular striations along the main ridge lines here, but at the same time we still keep their overall general formation. I would like to point one other filter as an alternative to hydro simulation in case your GPU isn't quite able to handle this particular filter. Let's go ahead and hide the hydro simulation and then add a new filter. And this time let's go up to Canyon and ensure Canyon Eroded is selected. This is going to give you some similar results, but at the same time, it's going to give you a more rocky feel. So if you didn't want the hydro simulation to be too smooth and you wanted a sort of a middle ground between smooth and rocky, then using the Canyon Eroded filter is a really good alternative because it still gives us these subtle details that we want while providing a more rocky structure. So the next filter we want to add is under the Basic Erosion category, and we're going to select the Wind filter. The Wind filter is probably one of my favorite filters as it adds a really nice effect over the terrain, almost like we're cheating a bit with the erosion. And for the strength level, let's lower this to be around 75%. And then let's set our length to be, instead of 2, let's set it up to 5. And if you notice the difference of what that did to our beach edge, it basically stretched out the effect. So depending on the look that you want, you may want this length to be a little bit lower or a little bit higher. The higher the value you have, the more erosive the wind filter is going to have along the terrain. Then the next setting is going to take a little bit of trial and error for you to figure out because it basically establishes the direction the wind is going to come from in relation to 360 degrees around the point of your terrain. So in our case, I want the direction of the wind to go from the sea and blow directly into the side of the terrain hills here. Much like you would see along the ocean edge, all that wind is going to blow into the terrain, thus smoothing out the edges while cutting deeper into the crevices of our ridgelines here. So, through trial and error, I found a direction of around 150 degrees seemed to be the right direction that I wanted to take this terrain. Now, again, I wanted to ensure that this wind filter is affecting the lower portions of the terrain, because for a tropical zone up in the higher elevations, this is essentially by Earth standards, fresh newborn terrain. So it's not going to be affected by the wind as much because it's really rocky and it's really tough. The terrain down here near the ocean edge is going to have all that sediment that's coming from the higher elevations, as well as all the sedimentation that you get from the ocean itself. So the wind is going to have a much more stronger effect on the lower elevations as it is the higher elevations. Plus, setting this to a height select, which is what we're going to do, will also remove this weird banding effect that the wind is having at the top of our mountain ridge here. So let's go ahead and ensure the height select option is enabled. And hovering my cursor around the terrain here, I want the wind to come up somewhere around this point and sort of fade into the hillside here. So I'm going to set the high point of my height range to be 100 meters. And you can see 100 meters is probably this edge here. We can ensure that by enable the heat maps. And you can see it is indeed that edge. And so that there's not such a harsh edge, let's go ahead and ensure the height smoothness for the top value is set to a pretty high number because I want this to be very gradual. So let's choose somewhere around 50 meters worth of smoothness. There you go, and you can see it's going from a pretty harsh area to a much more subtle area. This is exactly the effect that I want. We could do a bit more, but I think this effect is exactly what we need. Also, the wind isn't going to affect anything terrain-wise below sea level. So we can essentially set the height range for the low value to be about 0, which in this case is representing our sea level, but I also want it to smooth out some of that water to terrain transition. So let's make sure the height smoothness for our lower level is set to around 10 to 15 meters. There we go, that looks pretty good. Now at this point, let's go ahead and add another filter, but the filter that I want to use this time is so that we can really see some of these subtle streams that we were trying to implement in the very beginning. So let's go ahead and add a new filter, and this time let's select Erosion Soft. You can see the effect that this filter is having on our terrain is really highlighting those concave areas where the water would generally be. This is exactly the effect that I want, and there's not going to be a whole lot of mini small side streams in this case. We could add another erosion soft or a regular erosion filter and really fine tune those smaller minute streams, but in this case I just want the main streams to be highlighted since the water is going to be rushing really quickly off the higher portions of elevation and not have a chance for any of those small streams till they get to around the lower elevations where they'll start collecting together in little ponds and pools and a higher level of a river. So for this filter, we want the effect to just be in the region between the hydro simulation of the slopes and the beach edge. Erosion will start abruptly at the steep edge and be more smooth as it's emptying out into the sea. So again, we're going to select the height select option. And this time I want the streams to start somewhere around in this region. So let's set a value of around 150 in elevation value right here. And then let's ensure the smoothness is somewhere around 20 to 30 meters. So let's do 25. Let's select our heat map so we can see where this is taking effect. And in this case, I want the effect to be a little bit higher than that. So instead of the height smoothness of 25, let's set this to also around 150 meters and see what that does for us. There we go. That should be a pretty nice effect that we want to go after. So let's go ahead and uncheck the toggle heat maps. And just like the wind filter, the soft erosion filter is not going to have this sort of effect underneath the water because the sand is going to be very smooth. So let's select a height range as well of 0 meters to reflect the 0 meters at sea level. And then let's make its transition into the sea even more smooth. So let's set a height smoothness of around 50 meters for the lower portion. And 50 meters was just a tad bit too much, so let's try 30. And there we go, this effect is much better. That way the transition from the harsh river edge is transitioning into the sea really nicely. The next filter that we want to add is the sediment complex filter. So let's go ahead and select add and then go to the sedimentation subcategory here. You could use sediment here, but I'm a really big fan of how sediment complex works, which gives a little bit more detail to flow patterns. Before I click add and close, you can see that right here in this effect. It's essentially almost adding a smooth effect on top of everything else. So let's go ahead and select add and close. Now, obviously the sediment complex filter is very strong, a bit too strong for this case. We don't have this much sedimentation built up this high in our elevation anyways. So for that, we're going to ensure that we're doing another height select in this case. So enable height select. And for this filter, let's ensure that it is set to relative to ocean, which is this checkbox right here. When you select this relative to ocean checkbox, that means that the center point of these two values will always be 0, and the low range and high range will be any of the meters that you add above the ocean level. This filter is going to represent all the sediment that is rushing off the slopes pretty quickly, and then it gradually thins out as it empties into the sea. So for the relative height for the bottom, let's set this to something really high because we want it to encompass the entire sea floor. And then we want to set the height to be exactly 0 so that we can ensure that our top max value is always going to be exactly where we have our ocean edge. Now, yes, we could have had this relative to ocean edge unchecked and done all the relative height ranges that we want. But say in the case that we want this filter to be dynamically changing based on where our ocean height is, we can go over here to our left toolbar and toggle on the ocean to see exactly where our ocean level is. You see in this case, it is exactly where it needs to be. And to change this ocean level, you need to go up to the Scene tab, go over to Environment, scroll down till you see the ocean properties. Here you can actively change the ocean height to be anything that you want. I'm not going to do that here. I like it to be represented exactly at 0, but later on we may want to change this ocean height depending on how the terrain treats us in a little bit. So let's go ahead and uncheck the ocean level here. Go back to our Surface tab and Filters. And for the sediment complex, and let's ensure that the height smoothness for our top range is, say, somewhere around 20 meters. Let's enable the heat map so that we can see where it's being enabled at. And that looks pretty good in that area. Let's uncheck the heat maps and see what 50 does. So this does a pretty good job, but I'm losing all of that effect right here where our rivers are coming down the mountainside. I don't want to lose any of that effect, yet I still want there to be some sedimentation bleed from the river off into the ocean. So let's set this back to around, let's say 15 this time. And this effect is having a much nicer approach than we did before. And there you have it, everyone. We have successfully sculpted a base structure to our tropical biome and made some adjustments based on our filter stack. In our next extras episode, I'm going to show you how to properly design the beach edge to be a little bit more realistic. So, thank you for watching, everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.